So how the BitSight rating's calculated, before I dive right into that, I just wanted to say really, and Ali talked about this a little bit, what we're doing here is we're producing a continuous data-driven metric for security performance. People use that to look at themselves. People also use that to look at their critical third parties who may house things like data or may have access to their data. Obviously, if I'm a business and I've got a payment processor or something that I have to hand sensitive data off to, and that payment processor has issues and it's mostly my customers who are impacted, the questions are going to be asked of me and maybe not even of them. It may even be my organization that appears in the news. So people will use that to assess those critical vendors. As far as what we're doing, you can think of it this way. We're looking at any kind of security related data point that we can observe from the outside. We're doing that through a variety of different methods I'll talk about here in a little bit. But really, you can think about it this way. The data we're collecting on all internet facing assets around the world. That's going to be IP addresses and domains. So most of our data is going to come from our sinkhole infrastructure, and we do have the largest sinkhole infrastructure in the world. What we're doing there is we're sinkholing the command and control domains for different families of malware to be able to directly observe the communication when a device gets infected. So as far as what we're doing is as I mentioned, we're collecting those data points on all assets around the world. When we see it, we have a finding, and we know that that finding is associated with a particular asset, but we don't know who that asset belongs to at that point. So we have to go through some asset mapping. So what we do is we look at an organization from the outside, and we'll go and take a look at things like the regional internet registries to find things that are directly registered to them. We'll look at passive DNS to find some of their cloud hosted assets. We'll use BGP AS announcements to see what people are advertising. We'll look at things like domain tools to find domains that are registered to them. And from that, we'll build the infrastructure for an organization. We'll also take it a step further. If there's discernible sub-entities for an organization, we'll break those out as well. So if there's a subsidiary that has groupings of infrastructure registered to them, we'll separate those out on a family tree so that you can break it down in a more granular way to look at the risk associated with the entity that you most care about. As Ali mentioned, this does provide some value for folks on the first party side, just to even discover assets that they weren't aware of that are out there. We see it very commonly on our sales calls that we'll talk to an organization, they'll look at a finding, they'll say, hey, that's wrong, that's not an asset that belongs to us. And then they do a little bit more digging, and yeah, there is some asset that's out there that's still live that they thought had been, turned off years ago. So it does help a lot from that aspect. So once we've now identified what infrastructure belongs to that organization, we can then go back to all those findings that we have and say, okay, we know what assets belong to this company, and we know what findings belong to those assets, so we know what findings belong to the company. We'll break them out into three major buckets. These are going to be overall risk categories. 55% of that is going to be compromised systems. That's going to come from the sinkholing I was talking about at the beginning. So directly observing the communication from those different families of malware that we have sinkholed. 35% is going to be diligence information, and that's going to be configuration-based findings. That's going to come from a variety of methods. Some of it's going to be, us doing the analysis. Some of it's going to be some of the folks in our partner network doing the analysis there. All that's going to have individual weight as well underneath that 35%, and it's all going to be weighted based on the risk or the riskiness of that particular item. The last 10% is going to be user behavior. That's going to be really BitTorrent traffic that we're looking at there. And the reason why we look at BitTorrent, which is kind of a common question, is it really gives you a window. If we're evaluating a third party and they responded very positively to things like restricting user installed software or having a strong acceptable use policy and the technology to enforce it, and we see a whole bunch of BitTorrent findings, that's probably going to tell us that neither of those things are true. It also is a common gateway for malware into an organization, so it does present some security risk from that aspect as well. All those things are going to feed up into an overall rating that's between a 250 and a 900 that's really designed to mirror the consumer credit score, or the American consumer credit score. And it correlates the likelihood of experiencing a data breach, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. So that's really how the rating illustrates security risk, is through that correlation to the risk of experiencing a data breach. So we had 2 outside third parties come in and validate our data, the things that we were measuring, and really to do an examination to make sure that we thought we had a good idea as far as being able to illustrate risk present within an organization. Well, do we really? So we had 2 third parties, Advisen and AIR Worldwide, come in and take a look at that. And what they found was that for organizations that have, if you use 700 as the baseline, basically, anybody who drops below that into the 600 range, they're twice as likely to experience a data breach. Down into the 500 to 600 range, they're 3 times as likely. Down in the 400 to 500, 4 times as likely, and below the 400, 5 times as likely. So you can, just by looking at the rating itself, and there, for all the risk vectors we measure, there's going to be underlying data as well. So you can more deeply examine an organization beyond the rating or the grades of their risk factors. But if you even just stay at the rating level itself, it's going to tell you a lot about that organization and the risk that might be present. Same with looking at your credit report associated with your credit score. Your credit score itself may be what your lender uses to make lending decisions, but there are also going to be additional data points on there, like bankruptcies or past due loans, things like that, that they're going to make decisions about, and they may examine those individual data points individually there. So given that there is some usefulness to the number itself, how do people end up using that? So BitSight helps tackle security risk in a couple of ways. We've talked a little bit about both of these. Ali highlighted them a bit in the beginning. If I'm looking at myself, which we call security performance management, a few different ways people will use that is to assess their cyber risk, and they're going to compare it to some of their peers in their industry, which is really important. As Ali mentioned, if I'm telling the board that we're doing a great job, yeah, that's awesome, and I can show them a whole bunch of technical metrics, but if I can show them my top 5 competitors and that I'm absolutely killing them from a posture standpoint, they're going to feel pretty good about the stuff that I just told them. Efficiently allocate resources to address some of the cyber risks. I mean, nobody's perfect. There's always going to be an area where an organization's deficient, and that even goes up to some of the best ratings within our portal. And if you can identify those areas pretty quickly, it allows you to know, here's where we need to improve. And here's where we need to allocate budget. There are people we've worked with who didn't have great ratings, and were kind of excited about not having a great rating because they had been telling their senior leadership that they weren't in the best of shape and had no way to necessarily measure it or get them to believe it. It was really easy to show, hey, we're not doing quite as well versus our industry peers. We need more budget to address our security risk. So also set and track and report on program performance over time. There's a couple of tools within our platform that allow you to basically say, hey, here's what we can do to improve. Here's what we should expect if we achieve those particular items. On the third party side, I'm sure anybody who's involved in third party risk is pretty familiar with some of the pain points on the third party risk side. Usually you have your process is going to be to send out a questionnaire to the vendor. A lot of times they don't respond, or if they do respond, it's kind of just not the most reliable response. Those things are still necessary. Don't get me wrong. BitSight would never tell you to replace your questionnaires. We're really here to augment some of the things along those lines with some data, and to be able to help you make better decisions as to the questions we're going to ask. Because if we know they're deficient in certain areas, but they're really good in others, we may not need to drill into some of those areas that they're really good in quite as much. So we'll help the organization kind of be more efficient from that perspective. The other angle to it is a lot of people who are in vendor risk management are being asked to do just tons and tons of assessments. So how do you get those done pretty quickly? We give you some easy to use metric to be able to make some quick decisions about who you may be bringing on board or what steps you're going to take in that process. And that's how most of our customers use us on the third party side, is they'll break it out into comparing the inherent risk that vendor poses versus their BitSight rating. And hey, based on that comparison, here's the steps we're going to take during the evaluation process. So one of the other things I'll add there down at the bottom is the ability to collaborate with your vendors. So you can send them access to the portal. If you see anything that's concerning, the ideal case or the ideal way to use us is to send them access so that they can go and take care of those items. And let's say it was something really bad, and the ideal state or the ideal situation is that they take care of those items, and then the possible breach that was maybe going to happen never even happens because they have now taken care of that. And that's how you make not only your suppliers safer, but yourself as well. There's also some other additional use cases for cyber insurance, which is probably apparent from some of the things we've talked about. Critical national infrastructure, which is national governments monitoring their entire national infrastructure space and looking for red flags within it, or even sectors. So if I'm a nation that relies heavily on, say, banana farming, and we see that all of the security posture of all of our organizations that handle banana farming or banana distribution are in just terrible shape, and something were to exploit them, let's say something takes all their machinery offline, we're going to be in trouble because all of a sudden the industry our nation relies on isn't going to be effective. Also, people will use us during mergers and acquisitions to look at targets and determine whether there's some risk present before we bring them into our infrastructure. So on the third party side, a little bit about how it's integrated into the life cycle. And this is a slide from one of our workshop decks. We do third party risk management workshops with a lot of our customers during onboarding. A lot of people will integrate it into the evaluation of new vendors. I talked a little bit about that earlier, just to very quickly be able to make some decisions about how we're going to interact with them. Also allows you to focus on some of the key vendors. So you don't want to spend the same amount of time on an organization that presents you a low amount of risk and appears to be in really good shape. So this allows you to spend more time on the critical vendors who appear to be in bad shape. Investigate certain things like celebrity vulnerabilities. There's filtering capability to allow you to do that. As far as the operations go, being able to alert when something goes wrong and to set different alerts based on how critical that organization is kind of allows you to manage by exception instead of just doing everything the same. I mean, some of our customers may even go to the stage or get into the state of, well, for our low criticality vendors, we're going to do maybe we normally do an annual assessment, but maybe we're just going to reassess them if there's a posture change that triggers an alert. So, and of course, everybody's free to implement our data and use it in their decision-making process however they see fit. And then lastly, they'll integrate it into things like their GRC or TPRM platforms so that they can see everything in all in one place. So if you have a system of record, we have a ton of integrations out there. We also have a ton of API endpoints that you get access to with your subscription. So if we don't already have one, you can put one together and make use of it however you see fit there. One of the things we talked about was showing yourself versus some of your peers. In this case, this is a sample benchmark against some other organizations in the industry. The whole idea here being that you can just very quickly show some of those executives how we're doing, how we've trended, things along those lines. As far as benchmarking, another step you can take there is doing against an aggregated group of your peers. So you define that based on your industry, your company size, the number of assets you have, things like that. And it really gives you a good idea of where we are versus people who are like us. And then from there, you can actually break it down into a gap analysis and say, hey, versus people who are just like us, here's where the things that really stand out. So in the case over here to the right, botnet infection, spam propagation, potentially exploited. Those are things I would want to touch on first. So that's the end of my little spiel. I promised you it would be pretty short. I didn't see any questions come up in the chat, but if anybody has any, feel free to fire away and I can talk through it.